Okie doke. Well, thank you very much for having me here. I never turn down an invitation to talk about this stuff, and it's probably a personality flaw. But I do enjoy it, and especially I love graduate teaching, and I love talking to researchers who are so embroiled in their own projects and perspectives on this stuff. I find that to be some of the most rewarding conversations, and so. Unlike, there are other areas of the law where, like, I have my views, they're very entrenched. It's very hard for people to change my mind. But this is one of those areas where it's moving so fast and things are changing so much, and so many more people are entering the conversation with new perspectives that I find myself being constantly challenged to re-examine and re-articulate my position and sometimes maybe even to shift it a wee bit. So I'm very happy to have those conversations, and I look forward to hearing what you guys think about this paper and my approach to this issue. I'm gonna pause just before I begin to make sure is my speed, is my accent. I can't change the accent, but I can slow down what I'm saying, or feel free to interrupt me or ask me to repeat things if I don't want to be insensitive to the fact that you guys are probably all speaking and listening in second languages, and this is the only one I have, and I babble away in it far too fast. Are we good? Are you able to understand and follow? Okay, perfect. Um, all right. And also, given that you're all working and researching in TDM, there are obviously things that I don't have to explain to you. So I'll try as best I can to use the time to kind of highlight the aspects of the paper and my thinking that might be most useful or most perhaps controversial. Anyway, so I like to start with Dan Burke's piece on cheap creativity. If you haven't read that one, I think you should, because I think it's one of the most insightful things I've read about the sort of emergence and this growing ubiquity of generative AI and all the things that it can do, and the way that it is now challenging and substituting for traditionally human creative activities. Um, so, of course, we know copyright law is the law that allocates rights over creative works, ostensibly to encourage creative activities. So, it's not surprising that when we have this new technology, which is allowing for this completely synthetic substitution of human creativity, that we're going to have a bit of an existential crisis in the copyright field, right? That we basically run into something that I think is the most challenging moment for copyright law that we've had since really the arrival of the World Wide Web. Um, and certainly that is the sort of tenor of the conversations that we're hearing around AI and copyright regulation, right? We're hearing these sort of this is an existential crisis, not just for the copyright system, which we'll talk more about, but first and foremost for many creatives, professional creators, who find that their work and their whole sort of the profession can be displaced notionally, theoretically, and maybe soon practically by this new generative technology. And so that is leading us to have these debates about whether copyright law, which has, of course, traditionally been the law to which we turn to create and protect the rights of creative professionals, should be doing something more, anything, in order to protect human creativity in the age of AI. What I like about Dan's thinking on this is that he puts it in context, right? To recognize that rapid shifts in information and communications technology have always presented this sort of slew of new regulatory challenges, legal conundrums, in any field, and really particularly in the copyright field. And the way Dan put it, I think in the same piece, is that the history of copyright law really is the history of falling technological costs. The cheaper, more accessible printing technologies that arrive with the printing press is what precipitated the arrival of copyright in the first place, right? And then with each new technological innovation, the costs of dissemination, distribution, copying fell, and copyright law had to respond to those changes. So, you can chart it from sound recording technologies and radio, and then the camera, photocopiers, the television, VCRs, the personal computer, DVDs, the internet, peer-to-peer, BitTorrent, AI, right? And each time we have these new sort of previously unimagined opportunities to do new things in terms of consuming and distributing creative content. But each one of these has, for that very reason, provoked a new kind of copyright policy or regulatory crisis as well. So we have these new technology affordances, they're good and they're bad. And they hurt some people and they help other people. They increase sort of accessibility, they're more inclusive, but also they limit, therefore, privileges and exclusivities that people had previously. So everyone knows about, Jack Valenti railing against the arrival of the VCR and saying it was going to strangle and kill basically the movie industry. Um, Going back further, people made a lot of money painting portraits before the camera was a thing, right? And so you always have this sort of shift. And ultimately, as we know, it ends up being a battle over over money, over markets, and copyright law is called upon to respond. But from a principle perspective, policymakers have been pretty good by and large at recognizing first that copyright should be technologically neutral, but also that copyright law shouldn't really be the thing that obstructs emerging technologies, that shores up the business models of particular actors or industries in the face of new technological possibilities. And I think it's important for us to remember that because I think, once again, that's precisely what copyright law is being called upon to do. Okay, so that's kind of by way of introduction. You guys also know all about how ChatGPT is eating the world, and I presume if you're working in this area, you probably are familiar with that website and following all the various cases that are being fought over the role that copyright will play, both when it comes to controlling AI, text and data mining, obviously, and AI training, and then also though to a lesser extent, the production of competing outputs or artifacts in the cultural marketplace. Just to say that Canada is not immune to this, the three things on the right-hand side are current Canadian cases. So the Canadian news outlets are suing OpenAI right now for text and data mining on and tr AI training on protected published articles. Our sort of leading star AI firm called Cohere, a Canadian firm that the government was sort of celebrating initially, is now being sued by publishers in the US for its use of protected materials in AI training. And then the one that really annoys me, I have to be honest, and I won't dwell on it for now, but there's a CanLII case. So CanLII is the open access legal resources database that the sort of copyright minimalists amongst us fought so hard to create to make sure that legal information was accessible to the public and free. But now they are suing a third-party provider, commercial provider of AI tools, which trained its models on these publicly accessible legal materials. And so that's one of those sort of the paradox of openness issues, right? You fight for something to be open and then it ends up being closed and creating new sources of wealth and power, and exactly how copyright should respond to that. Um, we have to ask ourselves, but I'm not happy with that case and happy to talk more about it. Basically, though, this is where I think we are in the copyright to AI question. Now, some people think AI is going to be the death of intellectual property law as we know it. Certainly copyright as we know it, right? That it just cannot go on functioning the way it did. And the distinctions, the assumptions that underlie the whole system have been fundamentally changed or will be by this new technology. And then the other perspective is that IP or copyright is going to be the death of AI. That, as Pam Samuelson put it, copyright law is the only area of law that exactly already exists that could bring this new technology to its knees, that could freeze it, that could completely change its trajectory. Um, and so I think both things are true. Probably neither one will entirely come to pass, but I guess the point is in the meantime, the damage that each could wreak upon the other shouldn't be underestimated, right? That this is definitely a tumultuous time for both. Okay. Um, I wanted to back up a little bit before we get to the copyright trap piece, just to give you a sense of the sort of building blocks that led me to the point of frustration where I had to make that argument. And for those of you who are, thinking or wanting to become or already academics and publishing, like I think that sense of frustration building is important, right? Because that's the thing where eventually you're like, I've got to write this. I cannot listen to one more person say this thing that I disagree with without explaining why. And so that's where I got to on the AI issue, and that's where the copyright trap paper came from. But backing up a little bit, when I started working on this area, it was back in 2018 when I thought it was kind of, I don't know, it was certainly a bit of a niche area. I was co-writing with my friend Ian Kerr, who had been thinking about robots and law for years. And he was trying to persuade me that this was really an important sort of moment to intervene. It seemed kind of both too early and too late, but it was certainly for me the start of my thinking on this. And it was on that question of whether AIs can be authors, whether a machine can be attributed with the act of creativity, and whether the law or regulators should understand what the machine is doing, what the AI is doing, as essentially equivalent to what humans do when they create. And that seems to me like the core of a regulatory question, right? Where do you begin the regulatory analysis? How do you analogize between the AI activity and the human activity of authorship? Because, and I think our point really was in that paper, if you start with the wrong assumption, and you're making this sort of analogy between these processes that are not at all analogous from a regulatory perspective and from an ontological perspective, you are going to make a mistake in terms of how the law intervenes and how the law responds to the technological development. And so here what we argued was that machines are categorically just incapable of authorship. What they're doing is not creating, and they're not creating original expression because they have no expressive agency, because they have no capacity to create meaning, they have no intention to convey meaning. They're just ontologically incapable of those things. And it seems kind of facile and basic to insist upon it, but we were finding all the moments in the conversations where the words were being used or the expressions are being used that seemed to convey that that's what the machine was doing. People love the idea that it's just like a human mind. It's learning the same way, it's creating. They love to anthropomorphize the artificial intelligence, to imagine that it's speaking to them. And so it seemed really important to begin at the beginning and say that is not what's happening here. Okay. And you might say, well, why does that even matter? But it matters because of what copyright law is for, right? And so Ian's position coming into this paper was like, people are misunderstanding what the machine is doing. They don't understand what the technology does, what a predictive model is, what a large learning model is. It's just predicting, based upon tokens and producing things that have no meaning, and people misunderstand that. And then my contribution to the paper was to say, and they misunderstand what copyright law is and why it matters. Copyright law is there to encourage original expression because that's a human activity, the act of communication and the sharing of meaning and the building of knowledge that we think is socially valuable. And so if we can distinguish what the machine is doing from what the human is doing, And then we can say what the machine is doing is not the thing that copyright law is there to encourage. Then we should be able to answer the policy question just like that, right? We should be able to say there is no reason for copyright law to encourage, incentivize, or reward AI generation of outputs. Like there's it's just a completely different thing. And so that's what we were trying to get to, although it's not a copyright paper, it's really a paper about the ontology of creativity. Um, the other thing I wanted to do, because I had previously done work in this idea of technological neutrality in the law and thinking about how the law should respond to new technologies, and I wanted to avoid a kind of basic analogy again between old and new in coming up with legal solutions. And so this was a chapter in Ryan Abbott's book. You might know of Ryan Abbott because he's the lawyer who's helping pursue all the patents and copyright registrations on behalf of AI around the world. And we've been in conversation about that for many years at this point, and he included my chapter in his book, although he disagrees with every word in it, so that was nice of him. Um, but basically, what I tried to do there was draw the connection between the arguments about authorship and then the arguments about text and data mining to get to where we're going here, right? Which was to say that the AI is not, to my mind, when it's being trained on copyright material, using the copyright material in a way that copyright should care about either. So basically, just as the AI cannot be an author, the AI cannot be an audience. It can't be a recipient of a communicative message. It can't understand the meaning of a text. And so, really, to bring that activity into the copyright system would be anathema to what copyright is about, right? And also, I mean, just basic things like copyright doesn't protect information, it doesn't protect data, it doesn't protect original elements, it doesn't prevent learning. The idea that copyright law should prevent this seemed to me to be already a massive overreach and far more than what copyright, would normally do. And this is a very principled, basic approach. So I always said for technological neutrality, what I'm trying to do is say, like, we need normative neutrality, a principled neutrality, where we hold on to those big sort of principles and normative goals for the system, but recognize that new technologies are going to change how those should apply or how the law should respond to technology. So it's not just as simple as treating old and new alike. Anyway, this took us to is that the AI is not a recipient or an audience. That the use for training is not use as a work, an expressive work that copyright should care about, and therefore that copyright should neither be incentivizing and rewarding the use of generative AI by giving copyright to outputs, nor should it be obstructing or prohibiting the training of AI models. By finding that to be an infringing activity. I do still think, and I think it's not even particularly interesting or controversial, that of course, if outputs are produced that are substantially similar to things in the training data, that's going to be a primary infringement of copyright, and copyright already has all the tools necessary to deal with that eventuality. Okay. Um, Tempted to pause and check if we have questions, but maybe I should just follow my instructions and keep going for now to the next part. But do feel free to interrupt by just shouting at me if at any time you're moved to do so. Sorry, Alan. Okay, so I'll continue, and I won't spend too much time, but because you're doing this whole international tour of the world thing, I have to represent a little bit, and there's some discussion about Canada in the AI chat paper, which is funny because usually the US like you can't just submit papers about Canada to US law journals. Nobody there cares. And so I managed to sneak it in there. But mostly because I think like Canada's a really interesting example of like a government trying to respond, but torn between US and European approaches to these issues. Alice, did you have a question? Because your mic's off. I mean on. Okay, all right. Um, okay, so we have had in Canada this whole sort of narrative that I describe in the paper, and I'll only quickly point to because I do think it's telling, where we began with these sort of people thinking, well, gosh, we really want to become a fr AI friendly, innovative jurisdiction. We need to think of ways to encourage the investment to make sure we're not left behind. That's that sort of regulatory thinking piece. And then when people pointed out during the Copyright Act review that copyright might be an obstacle to AI development and training and research in Canada, the government report was like, oh dear, well, we shouldn't allow that. That seems unintentional. We should just create an exception that would make it possible to conduct informational analysis on copyright works, and that should just be clearly established. A couple of people spoke about this. It wasn't a big deal. It seemed uncontroversial, and I thought we were probably good to go. And the idea maybe was that Canada looks to the US a lot, of course, as a trading partner and as a competitor, and thinking that, well, if the US is going to become like the safe haven for text and data mining because of their broad fair use, we should make sure we're not left behind. And that is persuasive in a Canadian context. Even in Europe, I mean, I have many more concerns with the European approach, but at least there were carve-outs initially that would make it clear that some text and data mining was going to be lawful. I actually hate the European model because I think those carve-outs actually just confirmed that copyright was implicated without thinking about the practicality of being able to operationalize those opt-outs. Maybe that's something you're discussing in other contexts with people who are more um, familiar with the European model than am I. But I do think that's an example of a premature regulatory move that will have significant consequences and that I hope does not become the baseline for the global or international approach to this issue. Canada then had a couple of different consultations on it, and the first time I was able to organize like 12 or 14 different Canadian experts to all join together to say this should be fair dealing, we should enact that exception for text and data mining, we should probably move to a fair use model, and everybody was kind of on the same page. Unfortunately, nothing happened. Um, and then we had a whole second consultation specifically about generative AI once ChatGPT was more of a thing. And then everybody piled on. And the conversation was very different at that point. Let me see here. So there, first of all, I mean, they turned it to a questionnaire, so we couldn't submit multiple people responding anyway. But also, I found that the sort of coalition I'd formed of people who were prepared to say this was kind of dissipating. People were a little bit more torn about it. So that was an interesting development. In Canada, there's a lot of sort of European procreator rhetoric in the policy discourse, and that was beginning to take hold. And there's, of course, a lot of anti-big tech, anti-US stuff, and that was also dominating. And so people were starting to talk about, well, should they be getting this stuff for free? It doesn't seem fair. And so the ground was shifting. And as I pointed out before, the thing I most disliked about the second policy paper was that suddenly the idea of a copyright balance, which is sort of fundamental to Canadian copyright policy, a balance between the public and owners and users, and this is now something that has been repeated again and again by the Supreme Court that copyright needs to be balanced. Um, Suddenly that balance was re-articulated here as a balance between the cultural industries and the technological industries, and no one was talking about the public, no one was talking about users and fair use. And this was all a strategic sort of economic proposition about which sector needed the most regulatory support. And I just thought this was potentially very damaging from a copyright perspective. And this is what I found across, in again, the sort of global conversation as well. The idea that there are these two dueling industries in a way and we've lost sight of the public interest in the midst of that. Okay, so then the other thing that was concerning me in this ground shift was that I was beginning to see um, conversations about ethical and responsive and inclusive AI, which of course I am for. To be clear, I like the idea of ethical AI, AI for good. It should be inclusive, it should be responsible, or it shouldn't happen at all, right? And yet, I was finding that increasingly copyright norms were being pulled into those conversations. Like all of the other things about extraction and unfairness and injustice and pollution and the environment. And then it was like, and the extraction of human labor in the form of misappropriation of copyright protected works. Copyright has been thrown to the wind just for the sake of private profit. And now we have to sort of re-establish copyright norms that which have been flouted, and only then can AI be ethical if it respects these proprietary norms. And so I found that very concerning because my allies, I guess, were kind of departing, right? On both sides. Like my copyright allies, they seem to be disappearing and thinking, well, I don't know. And then on the other side, like on the technology side, the people who were concerned about ethical AI were becoming like the copyright maximalists of our time. And I was just beginning to feel a little bit concerned and a little bit lonely. And so this is the route into this copyright trap paper, right? Just recognizing that in some ways, what I thought anyway was that copyright lobbyists and copyright industries and the cultural industries and the publishers had managed to sort of co-opt the idea of ethical AI and responsible AI and to point to copyright as a way to rein in the excesses of artificial intelligence and big tech. Um, and and that by doing so, they were leading us into this copyright trap, right? That my suggestion is that copyright is going to be a false friend here. It's the copyright problem that's being pointed to. Oh, these models are trained on copyright works. I think is a diversion. I think it's a red herring. I don't see any immediate practical harm to the training on AI works. I don't see how that affects them, how it takes away anything that otherwise people expected to have. It might take away the potential of a windfall if that's what people imagine they can get from this whole new technological use of their work. But that wasn't something that people expected when they set about creating the works that are now being used to train the AI, right? So I thought, okay, that's a red herring. And then I thought, well, maybe really copyright is just being evoked as this sort of counterweight to corporate power, right? Like it's like, okay, this is what we have. We don't like the AI industry. Now we can plead copyright because this is an important political agenda. And then I just wanted to say, be careful because copyright is never going to be a counterweight to corporate power. Copyright is always going to be the source of corporate power. It's going to be the thing that takes away what the creators are trying to protect. It's going to be the thing that limits human creativity because it's about ultimately the market in content. And therefore, it's about commodification and capitalization, and it's not about equality and inclusion, and it never has been. So, so that's where I get to. You'll see I discuss, let me stay here for a second longer. You know, Kate Crawford does this excellent work on extractive logics of AI, but talks about consent and credit and compensation for human authors as a way to resist this extractive logic. Amanda Lewandowski does the same thing, saying, you know, fair use isn't fair anymore. There should be consent and compensation and credit. And maybe you'll be able to do more work with this when you come to thinking about cultural rights. I just kind of flag it in passing in the paper. Like this idea of consent, compensation, and credit, the three C's rule, comes from the Cultural IP Rights Initiative. It was inspired by the Nagoya Protocol and access to genetic resources. It's seen to be, or was understood to be, a way of demanding inclusion for weaker parties and benefit sharing. And here I'm just saying, well, how is it okay that we're now just saying everyone has the right to individually demand consent, compensation, and credit for every use of an expressive work or or the information contained within it? And why is no one calling bullshit on that, right? I don't think it's an appropriate use of the three C's. And I think it's a misuse, arguably, or an abuse of the concepts that underlay that initiative. So I'm interested to hear what you think about that. I love Timnit Gebru and her work on the Tech Won't Save Us podcast, but then similarly talking about the wrongs that are being done to human creators, I thought it became quite proprietarian again. Okay, so that was the copyright trap. It's a mistaken conviction that copyright law is going to be the right regulatory tool here for our purposes. Um, and the problems, like these are things you'll be familiar with. So, just very quickly, of these copyright restrictions that would flow from this, things like incomplete data sets, poor quality data, reliance upon public domain data that will exacerbate biases, closed proprietary data sets impeding research, impeding testing and transparency, but also limiting competition and limiting inclusion in the industry. And all of this, I suggest, is going to serve the interests ultimately of big media, of the big cultural and technological industries, who are perfectly capable of parceling out, affording, lawyering up, and gaining access to the data sets that they want and they can use. But in the meantime, what it means is that market logic, private ordering, private property prevail and become the thing that defines this next technological innovation. And the whole idea of credit and consent and compensation for human creators will all have fallen by the wayside because everything will have been commodified and alienated through these large licensing deals and exploited by the big corporations anyway. Um, okay. So I point to these three things. I won't belabor them because I think they're kind of clear and also they're not new. These are things in the copyright literature for the last 3 decades, right? But they're being used again, of course, in this new context. So one of them is this if value then right idea. Oh, well, people are gaining value from the work. Someone's making money from the work, and therefore there's a right to stop them from doing that. And that right is a property right. So who gets to make the money? Who gets to exploit? Who gets to exclude? And this idea that if value then right fallacy has been criticized persuasively for years, but it's being trotted out again now. So I just wanted to remind us of the fact that some things are valuable, some uses are socially valuable, but it doesn't imply necessarily that there is a thing over which someone has a right, or that that right is being infringed. And I think that the talk of even data mining and extraction implies that thing of value that is being taken. And I think it's the wrong metaphor and something that we should avoid. The second route is just this idea that copying is inherently wrongful, right? That if there's an unauthorized copy somewhere along the line, that that must be a copyright infringing copy and that that must be unlawful, and we need to find a way to prevent that from happening. And what I argue and uses the sort of technological neutrality thesis again, but let's not focus on the specific copies that are being made and technological processes that are not significant and not reaching human authors. Let's focus on the way that the technology works and the larger implications of that technology and what the control over copies would produce if it were to be enforced. And the third thing is this thing, which is the most sort of dominant strain in the rhetoric these days, this sort of misunderstanding about what copyright is and does and how it works, and this sort of optimistic characterization of copyright as being the thing that helps and saves artists. Copyright law in this context is not going to protect artists from the substitutionary effects of AI generated outputs. If there's any claim to control their work when it comes to AI training, there's no way that the license fee you would get from being 1 in 1 billion in a training data set is going to make up for the substitutionary effects of the technology. And so using it to say, oh, the assertion of copyright is going to help artists, we're doing it for creators. Again, I call bullshit. We've been saying this since the battle of the booksellers and the authors and artists, if they're starving, then it's because copyright hasn't been helping them and it's not going to help here. We have to think of other and better solutions rather than foreclosing those solutions by relying on copyright. And so that's really the point, right? And I go back to this old 1982 report on cultural policy. I can't remember if it's in the paper, but it's a Canadian report that I liked. When I first started looking at Canadian copyright regulation and just saying, copyright legislation only ever serves some authors, but nobody should be under the delusion that it's going to solve the economic or the social problems of authors. And so I'm saying that that is once again the case, and more so perhaps than ever, now that the technology is not only making it easy to copy and distribute, but it's making it cheap to create. That's Dan Burke's point. And so this is the sort of summary slide that those are the three routes into the copyright trap. These are the possible consequences of falling into the copyright trap. And ultimately, I caution against the sort of hubris of copyright lawyers, the same way Jessica Littman did back in the day when she said, what should copyright law be the thing that defines the rules of the game for the internet? Like the copyright lawyers have got a bit above themselves if they think that these are the basic rules of the road for this whole new paradigm shifting technology. And so I just say the same thing here. This is an instinctive overreach by copyright law. It's not apposite, it's not appropriate to the task, and in fact, it's going to do more harm than good. Okay, that's me. Thank you very much. And hopefully we have some time for some discussion. I look forward to hearing what you think.